Elvis had sort of more of a rock and roll, which everyone thought, oh no! Creativity back then versus creativity now is so different. It's not better or worse, it's just different. Howdy, it's Christy Grace and I am here with another I Spy in July video. Today I am going to talk about something that is really close to my heart and that is going to reveal a few things about me. You might be able to tell, have set up some stuff behind me. There is something about myself that a lot of people, particularly younger people, find confusing or strange or unusual, but I actually have really old school taste when it comes to a lot of things, and that includes TV, movies, and music. I'm fascinated with different times, different eras in the past, and it goes all the way back to my love of I Love Lucy. And I actually have a few things with me today. I have like a little Lucy pop things, and my screensaver at the moment is I Love Lucy. It's my favorite show, and I'm sure I've mentioned it probably time to time, but I grew up watching I Love Lucy, and I think that is, I'm 27 at the time of filming this, although in July it will be my birthday, so I will be 28. But I am relatively young for someone to love a show that was actually filmed in black and white and was from the 50s, 60s, so it's somewhat unusual. There are not a lot of people around my age, or, you know, even that little bit younger than me, who really know / are interested or have ever seen I Love Lucy or Gilligan's Island, which is another thing that I have up there. And I grew up on all of those shows. I grew up on I Love Lucy, Gilligan's Island, Get Smart. We grew up on I Dream of Jeannie, as you can tell. And I was so much of a fan of I Dream of Jeannie that I bought one of the bottles that you can get that are painted, which actually is one of the highlights that one of the most amazing things I've ever gotten and bought for myself, and I'm really happy that I ended up buying, because it's the coolest. But we grew up, we were brought up on all those older shows. Part of the reason was my parents were quite conservative, and a lot of the stuff that came out, I was born sort of at the beginning of the 90s, and a lot of stuff that was coming out when I was younger or when I was even getting a little bit older was, for them, it was not appropriate. It wasn't something that they wanted me to watch or expose myself to, especially when I was a kid and I'm growing up. And shows like I Love Lucy and Gilligan's Island were really safe to watch. There was nothing really bad in them. They didn't have overly sexualized stuff. There was nothing really super graphic or violent. There wasn't really much adult content in them, and kids could absolutely watch it and enjoy it, whereas also adults could too. And there was elements, of course, because they're about adults, so there was adult elements in there, but it was safe enough for us to watch, because it was all just fun, it was silly. A lot of those shows were just really clever and really smart, and that's another reason why I love them. A lot of stuff we get now, movies and TV, rely on the cheap jokes or the easy jokes, and back when I Love Lucy was coming out, you weren't allowed to talk about certain things or show certain things, and so you had to be smart. You had to go about it in a way where you couldn't just rely on a cheap joke or something that was inappropriate to hopefully get a laugh. You had to go and be clever, and if you wanted to have an inappropriate joke in there, you had to really be clever to get it past censors or to get it on the air, because they were more particular in what they allowed on the air at that time. And I love older movies and TV because of that fact. Because you had to be smart and you had to be clever, you had no choice. and you couldn't rely on a cheap and easy joke. You had to be smart about it. You still wanted the laugh. You still wanted to get something interesting out there, but you had to be clever. And that's where I think a lot of shows, not all of them, some shows written today are phenomenal, I have to say. And I do love shows from this century, but I adore the way that they were written back in the day, and saying that makes me sound like super old, but I love the way that they were written, the way they were made, and yes, a lot of it was still silly because it was slapstick or it was comedy, and even some of the more serious shows and movies, you know, that weren't slapstick or comedy was still incredible and amazing. And like you take something like Psycho with Alfred Hitchcock, he wasn't allowed to show all this stuff, but he managed to come out with a really amazing film, and it was really well done. I've heard it's actually something I haven't watched myself, but it's on my list. So you had to be clever, and they were clever, they were amazing, they were funny, they were genuine, it was real, it wasn't fake, it was real. It just didn't delve into intense or traumatic situations. And I think that especially as a kid, and even now as an adult who's had a bit more life experience, it's really nice to sit down and watch something that you can know for sure is not going to trigger something, it's not going to go into something that's dramatic or intense or potentially bring up stuff that you don't want to deal with. You want to escape. That's the whole point of movies and TV, is to escape and to enjoy what you're watching. And so I love that about sort of that 50s, 60s era of TV and movies. And it's just something that I still love today. And I don't fall into the category of we should colorize all the black and white TV shows. I Love Lucy does not have to be colorized. It's fine in black and white. It's great in black and white. It's a really nice change of pace. And even though they have done quite a few episodes that they have colorized, I don't think that there's a need to make it color. Like, I love being able to watch it in the black and white format and remember the past. I get to see all of the technology they didn't have, and the stuff they used in their phones. I would genuinely love a landline. It's just not practical anymore. But and I have a typewriter, which is right over here. So, and Lucy in several episodes uses her typewriter, and it's just hysterical to watch as well. So I genuinely love that era of TV in particular, and I just find it so refreshing, particularly when you see what we get now, and you compare the two. There isn't a comparison. What you had before was amazing and incredible. What you have now can be amazing and incredible. You can still be real without being super intense or without being crude or over the top. I really like most of the elements for the old school stuff. Yes, some of the times you've got to look at something in the era it was made in. So for example, in I Love Lucy, some people might watch that and get frustrated. Maybe it was a little bit of, you know, feminism was relatively newish in the 50s, I guess. And so there wasn't as much sort of that equality vibe in there going on. But you have to watch those things in the era that it was made. And when it was made, it was not supposed to be made to be offensive, and getting offended at something which is just in a time period is just ridiculous to me. That's just so silly. Like, come on. Like, don't get offended at everything. We can't view life in a lens of offense. You just can't. If you continue to see life and movies or TV in a lens of offense, it's not excusing stuff that's coming out now. If you come out now with something that's really offensive, that's different. But if you're doing something that's from the past, that came out when it wasn't necessarily socially unacceptable, you have to view that with the lens of, this was made in this time, in this era, when this was acceptable or it wasn't acceptable or whatever. So those things don't annoy me and they roll off my shoulders. I think maybe some of that because that's what I grew up watching, and some of it maybe just because I like the nostalgia of remembering a simpler, different time, I guess. But and enjoying what they came out with and the interesting things that they thought of. Creativity back then versus creativity now is so different. It's not better or worse, it's just different. And so the ideas that came out in the 50s, 60s are really different to the ideas that came out in the 2000s or in now 2020, 2021, ideas and content and stuff that comes out is always different depending on the year or the era that it comes out in. And it's always interesting to me to see where the creativity was, where the ideas were, and you get to see that in a TV or a movie. But I am not strictly a 50s, 60s girl. I do enjoy other eras as well. I have recently, actually relatively recently, discovered just how much I love the 80s. I really would have loved to have been alive during the 80s. I like the style, I like the music, and I like the TV and movies that came out in the 80s. I find it's a very big comparison to the 50s or to now. It's a totally different era. When you take something like, for example, I think 21 Jump Street came out sort of in that 80s time. It was in that sort of 80s period. I love, one of the shows that I desperately love that I have only just recently discovered is actually behind me. I brought it with me up here. Remington Steele. So I love a good crime show. Love, love, love. It's part of what I do. I am a crime writer. I love seeing what the investigations that happen and catching bad guys or whatever it is. I do love that, and I find that a lot of stuff that we get now when it comes to detective shows is super intense. It's so crazy. Some of the stuff we're watching, it's insane, and it's lost some of its comedy. And so what I like about, because you can be comedic, and there are some comedic shows which are crime related. You just look at something like Brooklyn Nine-Nine or Castle. Those are a bit more current and they still have that sort of comedy element in them. But what we can get away with now is different than what you could get away with in other times and eras. And you know what? I feel like the 80s, people were starting to come into different requirements for TV. They were coming into different, more freeing, I suppose, elements when it came to TV or movies and what you could show and what you could do and what you could talk about. And so it's really different to contrast the 50s, 60s more constricted view to and to now, where it's basically anything goes if you're looking on Netflix. But that's just one person's opinion. But Remington Steele, I think, had a really fun balance. It had a great comedy element in there. It was light, it was funny, it was sort of a mixture between what I would classify as white collar and Castle. And so you had that element of potentially conning people and then also figuring out a mystery. And it wasn't always a murder. A lot of shows now, it's just always a murder to solve every week. This were not. Some weeks it would be a heist, on some weeks it would be a murder, or sometimes a robbery would turn into a murder, or there would be really cool, fun, quirky mysteries to solve, missing persons, or something really interesting. And what I loved about Remington Steele, apart from the fact that the actors were phenomenal, and I love Pierce Brosnan, but also I loved Laura Holt, the main character, because she was a female detective, and at the time it was not as common for women to be... I should have just got a picture for that, and I ended up having to turn it back on. But I love Remington Steele because even though there was struggles with gender dynamics, men versus women, and being a good detective, and people taking you seriously or not taking you seriously, hiding who you really are. There was all of these elements to this show, and it was amazing. And you got that every episode. You got that comedy, you got that mystery, but you also got all of these really interesting life dilemmas or topics to talk about or go through. And it was really, really fun to watch that show. It was a detective show, but it was interesting. And it was funny, and it was genuinely surprising. A lot of shows now are really, really easy to guess. If you have watched enough crime shows like me, and if you have watched a show long enough, all TV shows follow a format. TV shows follow formats, they follow procedures, they go through the motions, and especially after you've been doing a show for several seasons, you get into a swing of things and you sort of end up in the same sort of space. And so sometimes it's really easy to guess how a mystery is going to unfold. Sometimes it's really easy to guess who the murderer is, or who the bad guy is, or what's going to happen, what are the characters going to do. It's so easy to guess, and sometimes that takes the fun out of things. But when it came to Remington Steele for me, or some of those other ones, I think I watched Moonlighting, which also had, it was a very similar vibe, but a little bit different. I prefer Remington Steele, although don't get me wrong, Bruce Willis is a very underrated comedy actor. He doesn't get a lot of comedy roles anymore, but he is really funny. I'm just gonna put that out there. But Remington Steele, even though maybe you might have been able to guess who the bad guy was at the very beginning or really close to the beginning, it didn't matter because the journey was really fun. And a lot of shows these days, the journey isn't always as fun. Half the time, I definitely couldn't guess the bad guy, and I think some of that comes out of different era, different format back in when it was made. But some of that came out of, it was just really clever. The mysteries were really clever. They were smart, it was funny, and it was clever. And that's one thing that I really, really liked about it. I think a lot of the 80s shows, sort of 80s, 90s shows were really interesting too because they started to open up things a little bit. You had a few more things that you could show and that they were showing and talking about as well, which were a little bit different to what had been allowed to be shown previously. Now everybody was color as well, so that was fun, but also the style. I love Laura Holt's style was phenomenal. I loved seeing her outfits. And one thing that I really enjoy about having time period shows and movies and things to watch is that they inspire me in the clothes that I want to wear. Sometimes I mix things up really different, and so it's fun to be able to get inspired to do more of an 80s type of a theme outfit and see how I could put together things I have in my closet a bit differently and have some fun with that. Like I said before, I'm not totally down on all the stuff that you get now, but there was something about the movies and TV that they came out with in the 50s to the 80s, even some of the 90s shows that you got were really just different to what you have now. And part of that, I think, is just it comes down to that was the time and that's what it was in that time. And it's really fun to sort of see that and get a flashback and a glimpse into a time when I wasn't alive or when I wasn't able to experience some of those things that were experienced. And yes, some of those were bad, but some of them were really cool and really good. And I am just fascinated with anything old and vintage or things like that. And hence my fascination with typewriters. It's also what led me to one of my favorite things in life, which is my vinyl collection, because I am fascinated and interested with stuff like cassette tapes or VHS tapes, which I own, but I love vinyls. I actually have some little ones I brought up here. I've got a whole bunch of Frank Sinatra in these little tiny mini LPs, but these were like the singles, which were really small. And it started me on my fascination with vinyls. It's really different to listen to a vinyl than it is to listen to something on your phone or even on a CD. And definitely different than a cassette tape, although I own a few tapes, but no player to play them on. So that's, you can buy those, but that's another video. But I love vinyls. The music that came out when vinyls were the way to get music was so different as well. And when you think back to the music that we were releasing in the 40s, 50s, I think I have 20s records as well. It's also different. And there was, again, you weren't really talking about certain things or saying certain things when it came to music. There wasn't really curse words in music. The type of music that was coming out was just so different. And every generation and every season had their own things that came out. Elvis had sort of more of a rock and roll, which everyone thought, oh no. And then you had people who came out with things like punk records or things that were just really different than what was coming out now. So you still had music growth, but it was just at a really different time when maybe you weren't singing about, beating up your girlfriend or cheating on a guy because you felt like it, or it's just different. It's different time, different feels, different, just different. What I find the best about music on vinyl is that romantic songs were romantic. Love songs were romance. They weren't getting laid. They were romance. And there was some really beautiful music that came out. Stuff wasn't all just, flowers and candy. There was some really interesting, cool stuff going on in the music time. In short, even though this hasn't been particularly short on my ramblings about movies and TV from the 60s and 50s. But in short, I love some of the old school taste. I have old school taste. I'm an old soul, I suppose, if you want to call it. Some of my views on life are a bit more old school, and some of my tastes in music and pop culture are a bit more old school as well. And so I like that about myself, and I think that more people should expose themselves to what we had back when TV was beginning, back when music was different, back when things were not all online and not all on the internet, and I couldn't have done a video like this and posted it about how much I like all of the old music and TV. So it's fun to go back and remember, and I think it's important to expose ourselves and our kids to different things and learn different things. Not just all of the new stuff, but all the stuff that got us to where we are today. Things that came out that made it possible to do what we do today. I Love Lucy was the first TV show ever to use 3 cameras, and now all sitcoms, at the same time, all sitcoms now are doing that. Everybody does that. And so remembering where we came from, the things that got us to where we are, I think is really important, and it's really fun. It's fun to watch shows like I Love Lucy and Gilligan's Island and Remington Steele. They're fun. We need more fun in our lives, less worry and stress and fear, and more fun. And it's good to do that. It's good to take a break, to take time and just step into another world. It makes life more interesting. It really does. I hope that you have some old school tastes. Don't leave me hanging out here just by myself. I'm the only person in the world who likes old stuff. Maybe you love old books. I love Sherlock Holmes. Is a great character. I love Sherlock Holmes. Maybe you like an old TV show or movie that I mentioned. Maybe it's music as well that you dig, Frank Sinatra or Nat King Cole or Shirley Bassey. Or maybe you just like something from the 90s or the 80s or the 20s. 20s music is crazy, man. 20s music is nuts. But let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear about it. I want to know what you like that isn't necessarily from this century, maybe, or even the last 5 years, something a little bit older. Some of the 90s came out with some amazing shows. I just have to say, as an aside as well, some of my favorite shows were Mad About You, I Love Lucy, Friends. Like, we had some amazing stuff happening in the 90s. And so, I mean, yeah, there's lots of great stuff out there that I love, and I want to hear that you love it too. Make me feel like I'm not alone. And share what you like that might be old school or that other people tell you is old school. Let me know in the comments, and if you want to watch any of the other I Spy in July videos, check out the playlist, and I will see you guys in the adventures.